Hello, Exploration of Visual Art class. I know you've missed me. I hope you all had a great Easter weekend and that you had an opportunity to worship in some fashion and celebrate the risen Lord. Today we are going to talk about texture, and texture is the last of the initial elements that I told you about for visual communication and visual form. Now, when we talk about texture, we have to talk about both 3D objects and two-dimensional objects. And both of those objects, whether it be 2D or 3D objects, texture is the perceived surface quality of a work of art. Now, that is perceived through touch and also perceived through sight. It's an element of two-dimensional and three-dimensional design and is distinguished by its perceived visual and physical properties. Now, physical texture are the physical surface qualities of an object. They can be felt through touch. Or physical texture is what something actually feels like when you touch it. A physical 3D thing will have both physical and visual surface properties. That means that when you look at something, it's not just going to, or when you look at a 3D object, it's not just going to have physical properties, but because you can see it, it's going to have visual surface properties as well. Now, visual texture are the visual properties of an image that translates a sense of physical texture through reflected light rays or through the emulation of two-dimensional or three-dimensional media. Or, basically, visual texture is you imagine what it must feel like because of how it looks. Does that make sense? So like a physical thing will have both physical and visual surface properties. A two-dimensional object or work of art will also have both physical and visual surface properties. Now, the two-dimensional art will look like it might have a sense of texture, like on your screen right now. You might see this thing behind the word texture that looks like it's made out of scratched metal. Now, it's not really made out of scratched metal, but I can imagine what it might feel like if I were to run my hands over something that looked like that in the real world. So I can imagine what it must feel like based off of how it looks. Okay. So here we go. Again, these are just the official definitions of texture. Use of texture along with other elements of design can convey a variety of messages and emotions. I find that texture is really strong at unifying a design, taking lots of different elements and unifying them into what I call the world of the visual design. Now, physical texture primarily refers to 3D objects or things like sculpture, but physical texture can also apply to 2D objects or the flat surface of the thing. Now, some of you might be looking at a television, some of you might be looking at a computer screen right now. So there's like a paper texture, cream paper texture in the background, but there's also a physical texture. If you took your finger and ran it across your screen, there is an actual physical surface there. It's not the primary thing in a 2D object, but it is still there because the thing that you're looking at it on is indeed a physical thing. So, here are some examples of physical texture that are used in order to create artwork. These are pieces that are used to make what's called a collotype. A collotype is a type of printmaking process where you take physical things and you put printmaking ink on them, and then you press them against a piece of paper, and what results is a visual impression of the physical things. Now, as you're looking at this, can you think in your mind what these physical things might be? For instance, what is this stuff over here? Some of you have probably really enjoyed popping these things, which is affectionately known as bubble wrap. Okay, so how about this section right here? What is this thing? If you said cardboard, you are correct. How do we know it's cardboard? Well, because it looks like cardboard. All right, well, how about this one right here? Can any of you tell me what that is right there? If you said the skin of an elephant, you would probably be wrong, but it does look like what? How many of you said sandpaper? Good! Now, this right here, anybody got a guess what that might be? If you said tinfoil, of course you're correct, because we do know what tinfoil looks like when it gets all crinkly. And finally, this is probably just some sort of paper down here. Now, physical texture, again, is always going to be present with a physical object. A physical object is always going to have physical texture, or the way that it feels, and it's also going to have visual texture, the way that it looks, and we can kind of imagine how it might feel based off of how it looks. This is a sculpture called The Gates of Hell. A nice, pleasant title, I know, by the French artist Auguste Rodin. And it's primarily made out of bronze, and it's one of his most famous sculptures. It has actual physical material that you can actually feel, physical texture, but even though you have probably never felt this sculpture, you can probably imagine what it might feel like, even though you're just looking at it and you've never had the opportunity to actually touch it. In fact, if you did probably go and try and touch it, you'd probably be tackled by a lot of French guards. The visual properties that you see on the Gates of Hell allow us to imagine what the object might feel like, and that is called its visual texture. Now, what are 3 adjectives that describe how you imagine this sculpture might feel? I'd like to avoid temperature adjectives like cool or warm, more like non-temperature feeling adjectives that have to deal with physical touch. This is a close-up view of the Gates of Hell. See if this helps you with any adjectives that you might have. Now, I'm going to point out one little thing right here, and this is a little bit of a homework assignment for you. There's a figure up here that is a very small version of another extremely famous Auguste Rodin sculpture. And this is where the large version came from. And the Gates of Hell are actually based off of Dante Alighieri's Dante's Inferno. And so it even has the inscription, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter." Again, very welcoming type of sculpture. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to take you to a place where I actually have visited before in England, and it's called Brimham Rocks. It's in North Yorkshire, England. It's around the area where I actually did my master's degree. And if you go there now, you can no longer see this rock formation right here that has been precariously bouncing on that little tiny pyramid for millennia. And the reason why you can't see it anymore is because last year a bunch of teenagers actually pushed it over. So it had been sitting there for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, and then a few lousy teenagers push it over in a few seconds. Yeah, I'm just going to leave you with that as to what must have been going through their minds in order to do such a thing. But looking at the stone, do you think you might know what it feels like, even though you've probably never been there and touched the stone? This is another area from Brimham Rocks, and I actually did a day there where we went drawing, and we sat and we drew the rocks and the formations. And the reason why we did that is because there's actually a very, very famous sculptor out of England who grew up in Yorkshire area, and he actually spent a lot of time drawing Brimham Rocks as well, and you can definitely see that in his sculpture. In fact, if you looked at his sculptural forms, you could actually see those sculptural forms living in the rocks, and he's just kind of abstracting from the rocks different shapes and different curves and things like that to make his work. I have superimposed one of his works into the rocks so that you can see how they conform to the natural undulations of the stones that he's seeing. I mean, this area right here, that little incropping, you can actually see that right here. Not that he's using this particular rock in particular for this particular sculpture, but these types of forms are actually all over the place in the Brimham Rocks area. Here's the actual sculpture of the artist Henry Moore. It's called Recumbent Figure. It's made out of green Horton stone, and he did it in 1938. And again, you could see the undulations of the rock forms in his work. They're based off of the undulations in the rock forms from Brimham Rocks. And he translate those forms into different subject matter, but he always maintains, I think, a high fidelity to his inspiration from the rocks. So this is a recumbent figure. Can you tell me whether it's male or female? Here's another view of the recumbent figure. I hope you can guess which gender it is based off of what the artist is giving you. We can't rely on Shakira this time because there's not really much in the sense of hips that we can distinguish. So, physical things will always have physical texture. You can actually go up and touch them and you can sense what they're going to feel based off of your sense of touch. Now, based off of your experience of your sense of touch, when you look at something, you can imagine what that feels like even though you're not touching it, and that is its visual texture. So we're going to move on into visual texture, which is the primary textural sense of two-dimensional artwork. Two-dimensional artworks include paintings, photography, computer screens, television screens, prints on paper, anything that is flat that exhibits some sort of emulated physical texture deals with visual texture. Now, just to show you that Henry Moore actually was a good artist instead of those of you who might think that he was just a bunch of crap copying rocks. He also has done a number of sheep drawings because sheep are very prevalent in Yorkshire. And he does these beautiful, very simple sheep drawings on paper. So how exactly does Henry Moore communicate the texture of wool and grass in this pen drawing? I mean, when I look at it, I can see and kind of like feel the texture of wool when I look at the sheep because I've felt wool before. And he's capturing the wildness of the grass that they're in, through his various pen strokes in the foreground. But the pen strokes are different for the grass than they are for the feeling of the wool. And for some reason, when we look at it, we're like, yes, that's wool and that is grass. The next piece I'm going to show you is called The Lioness. It's by an artist that I'm not really familiar with. I just found this on the internet. And the artist is Alexander Levitt. Now, when you see this one, you're probably going to ooh and ah because it is freaking awesome. In fact, I'm a little mad because I can't draw nearly this well. So, this is the lioness. And what I find really fascinating about this particular piece is how he can communicate the textures of lots of different surfaces through one medium, and the medium of pencil. So the bark over here looks different than the fur on the lioness, right? Which looks different than the smooth stone up here, which looks different than the rough stone over here, which is completely different than the foliage over here, which is completely different than the very thin grass that's appearing over here. And he's doing that all with a simple medium of pencil. So what this means, of course, is that he has extremely good control over that particular medium, and he has an extremely good ability to visualize and observe the world around him, and he can communicate that world around him through a very, very base material that's basically graphite or pencil. I think this is a beautiful, beautiful piece. I'll give you a little bit of a close-up so you can tell and see the difference between the fur and also the background around it with the stone and the grass. Now, an artist that you've probably heard of before, Vincent van Gogh, who was a Dutch artist. This is Wheat Field with Cypresses from 1889. It's oil on canvas. Now, when you see it from a distance, it looks pretty flat. The closer that you get to it, however, you can see that he actually has built up a very, very thick texture of paint on the surface of his canvas. Van Gogh is known as a plein air painter. Plein air is Pleinaire. That's French. It means like an outdoor painter. So he would go on site with his tubed paints and his canvas, and he'd set up his easel, and he would paint what he saw in the landscape, and the painting would take place over one sitting of a few hours. Now, to contrast that, here's an extreme close-up of the surface of his painting, which I just think is extremely fascinating. To contrast that, we go back a couple hundred years from Van Gogh to an artist, a Dutch artist, named Jan Vermeer. And his surfaces were built up very slowly over an amount of time, and you can barely see, or hardly see at all, any brushstrokes, which is very different from Van Gogh, where you can see every brushstroke. Now, over the years, the surface of the painting, the very top surface, is cracked a little bit, but it still would feel very, very smooth to the touch if you were to run your hand over it. But if you did, a bunch of Dutch guards would tackle you and probably expel you from the country as well. Girl with a Pearl Earring is a very, very famous painting. You've probably heard of it before. But notice just how smooth the transitions are between light and dark. It has a very, very different feel to it visually and physically than the Van Gogh piece that we just saw. Putting them close or side by side at an extreme kind of degree of magnification, you can see the physical differences between the applications of paint between the two artists. Both of them were Dutch artists. Van Gogh was working about 220 years after Vermeer was. Both of them are considered great masters, though they were both working in very, very different styles. Now, the question I have on your paper is, Does each texture work appropriately for each piece? And I would argue yes. Van Gogh is using the qualities of paint expressively in a way that Vermeer is not. Vermeer's very detailed and very, very smooth approach fits the contemplative and almost meditative quality of his work, whereas the frenetic energy that Van Gogh worked with is absolutely perfectly captured in the quality of his brushstrokes, which remain visible even over 200 years after his death. Not 200 years, 40 years after his death, about. So, it says on your page to use 5 adjectives to describe the texture in each piece. I'll leave that up to you to do. Now, the final question, of course, is can we anticipate what something might feel like just by looking at it? I'll finish with a few more pieces. Here we have an artist called Constantin Brancusi, Italian. This is a bronze sculpture called Bird in Space. It's called a futurism movement from the early 20th century. It's abstract, of course. But do you think you might know what that would feel like if you were to go up and touch it? So metals are really interesting because metals can actually take on a lot of different surface quality textures. Now you might be using an adjective in your mind like smooth when you look at this particular sculpture. But if we go back a few thousand years to Egypt, this also is made out of bronze. This is a mummy head for a mummified cat. And the cat is the personification of the goddess Bast. Bast was a cat deity in ancient Egypt. Now, if you were to run your hand again across this surface, it would feel smooth, but it wouldn't be quite as smooth as the Brancusi bird in flight sculpture, or bird in space sculpture. Here is another sculpture that is of the goddess Bast. Now this would have been a votive sculpture that would have been in the Temple of Bast in Egypt. This one's rare in that it maintains its gold earring. A lot of the gold was taken in ancient times. So, changing it up a little bit, this is a photo that I took in 2013 in China at the Shanghai Bronze Museum. So again, same material of bronze, but now we have a quite different surface than we've seen on the other two. The other two were both meant to be smooth, but one was highly polished, one was just smooth on the surface, but this one is actually designed to have visual texture associated with it. And here's a close-up of the head. Now what this is a ceremonial wine pitcher. They would pour out wine during religious ceremonies in ancient China with these vessels. Now the cool thing about this is that this is cast from a mold, so anything that sticks out, like this eyeball right here, this is actually indented into the mold, and anything that goes in is actually sticking out of the mold. So all this really fine detail through here is actually sticking up out of the mold when it is made. So these things were precisely crafted, and the molds were probably one-offs, which means that you could probably just make one of them and then that was the end of it. Now, a piece that I hope that you remember from Monuments Men is here you have the Ghent altarpiece. Now, Jan van Eyck, who was a Flemish painter, Flemish means in the area around Belgium, he's considered one of the very first masters of the oil painting medium. And the reason why he is because of the beautiful surfaces and detail that he could create using oil paints that other people had not been able to do until his innovations. Now, one of his innovations was glazing, which means that the painting that you see is actually done mostly in browns and blacks, and that builds up the surfaces and the volumes of the forms. And then he goes back over those with very thin layers of transparent or translucent paint, like the reds and the greens and the blues and things like that. And he builds up about 20 or 20 different layers of these glazes, and the light goes through these transparent glazes, hits the background painting, which was painted in browns and blacks, and then comes back out. So with his technique, the paintings actually have a sense of luminance from within the painting because light is reflecting out through the various colors. Now, I'll show you some details of this painting. This is considered one of the greatest works of art in Western culture, and that's throughout all time. So it's a very, very important and significant painting. This is a detail of one of the angels in the top left choir that surround Mary and God and John the Baptist on the right-hand side. So I'm pointing out like the crown on this angel and the various jewels that there are. Now this is a secondary detail. So when we get to one of the more important figures, like the figure of God in the center top, the detail goes even more crazy. And he treats every one of these pearls like it is an individual pearl. And there's thousands of these pearls on the actual robe of God the Father, who's at the center. So you have pearls, and then you have these faceted sapphires in various shapes surrounding it, and this kind of gold in between the reds. It's just absolutely amazing and just blows my mind every time that I see it. Now, I'll leave you with this image right here. And I bet you that even if you've never touched an elephant before, I bet you can imagine what this feels like just by looking at an image of the elephant. So with that said, remember that your quiz is going to be by Thursday midnight. And I hope that you're all doing well. If you have any questions, please email me. And don't forget to smash that like button. Love you guys, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.